Do you live in Auckland, Hamilton, Rotorua, Taupo, New Plymouth, Napier, Palmerston North, Whanganui, or Wellington? Do you live anywhere on New Zealand's North Island? If the answer is yes, you need to watch this full video, because in the early hours of Saturday morning, while most of the country was still asleep, the ground underneath the central North Island broke open without warning, and what scientists are now saying about it should concern anyone living near the Taupo Volcanic Zone. It happened at 4:51 in the morning. Most people were in bed. Some were in that deep, early stage of sleep where the body barely registers anything. And then the shaking started. GeoNet, the official geological monitoring agency for New Zealand, placed the epicenter 5 kilometers south of the town of Taumarunui, a small community sitting on the edge of the King Country, right where the crust of the North Island begins to stretch and thin toward one of the most active volcanic belts on the planet. The magnitude was 5.9. The depth was just 9 kilometers. And that depth is the detail you need to hold on to, because in earthquake science, shallow means dangerous. A deep quake spreads its energy out over a huge area before it ever reaches the surface, softening the blow by the time it gets to you. A shallow quake does the opposite. It punches straight up. 9 kilometers down is about as close to a direct hit as this region ever experiences, and GeoNet's own measurements confirm it. The shaking near the epicenter was officially classified as severe. Here is why this is serious. GeoNet's shaking model assigned this event a maximum intensity of 5 on the modified Mercalli scale. At that level of intensity, furniture does not just wobble, it moves across the floor. Objects fall from shelves. Buildings can suffer real visible damage, even if they do not collapse. That is not a distant statistic. That is a family waking up to the sound of glass hitting the ground. That is a bookshelf emptying itself in the dark. That is exactly what happened in Taumarunui and the surrounding district, where residents were jolted awake by a rolling, grinding motion that many later described as the most frightening thing they had ever felt in their own home. Think about what 4:51 in the morning actually means for a small rural district like this. It is not rush hour when people are alert and moving. It is not early evening when a family is gathered together in one room. It is the deepest, most vulnerable part of the overnight hours, when children are alone in their bedrooms, when elderly residents are asleep without anyone nearby to check on them, when the whole town is essentially defenseless against a sudden, violent jolt with no siren, no alert, and no warning of any kind. Earthquakes do not send a text message first. There is no 5-minute countdown. There is only the moment before and the moment after, and for the people of Taumarunui, that moment after arrived as a rolling, grinding wave of motion strong enough to knock ornaments off shelves and send people scrambling to work out whether their house was still standing around them. By 6 in the morning, less than 90 minutes after the quake struck, nearly 23,000 people had already filed felt reports with GeoNet. And here is the detail that most coverage missed. The duty seismologist on call, Sam Taylor-Offord, pointed out that GeoNet's system only captures felt reports in the first 5 minutes after impact. Everything after that does not get formally logged the same way, which means the real number of people who felt this earthquake, from those first reports through the hours that followed, could be in the high tens of thousands. This was not a localized event. It was felt from Auckland in the north, through Hamilton, Rotorua, and Taupo, down through New Plymouth, Napier, Hastings, Palmerston North, and Whanganui, into Wellington, and all the way across the strait to the top of the South Island. Millions of people live inside that footprint. Millions of people had their Saturday morning interrupted by several long seconds of the ground refusing to stay still. But here is the problem. This earthquake did not happen on a fault anyone knew about. Most large earthquakes in well-studied parts of the world happen on structures that scientists have already mapped, measured, and modeled. Not this one. GeoNet's official science response described this as a normal faulting earthquake, meaning the crust in that part of the Australian plate is being pulled apart, stretched thin, until it eventually snaps along a sloping fracture and one block of rock drops relative to the other. That process is well understood in general terms. What is not understood is exactly which fault did it, because when scientists checked the New Zealand active faults database, there was no mapped active trace anywhere near the epicenter. The King Country is one of the quietest, least studied corners of New Zealand's tectonics, sitting between the heavily monitored plate boundary zones on either side of it. A duty seismologist told national broadcaster RNZ that this was the first earthquake ever recorded at that exact location. Not the biggest. The first ever in the entire instrumental record. Most people are missing this, but the exact location of the epicenter matters here. Taumarunui sits in the King Country, a rural stretch of the central North Island better known for farmland forestry and river tourism than for seismic hazard. It is not one of the places New Zealanders are trained to think of as earthquake country in the way Wellington or Christchurch are. And that is precisely what makes an event like this so unsettling. The instruments that monitor the well-known plate boundary faults are dense and sensitive. The instruments watching quiet rural country like this exist too, GeoNet's network covers the whole nation, but the underlying knowledge of what lies beneath that quiet country is thinner. Scientists can tell you an earthquake happened, exactly when, exactly how deep, exactly how strong. What they often cannot tell you, in a region like this, is which specific crack in the earth actually did it, because nobody had ever needed to map it before. This is where it becomes dangerous, because an unmapped fault is not a rare curiosity in New Zealand. It is almost a pattern. In 2010, a completely unknown fault near Christchurch, later named the Greendale Fault, tore open without a single prior warning and produced the magnitude 7. Warren-Darfield earthquake, an event that reshaped how New Zealand thinks about hidden seismic risk to this day. Nobody knew that fault existed until the ground itself told them. The scientists studying Saturday's quake near Taumarunui are now saying almost exactly the same thing, that much of the country's strain is being carried on faults buried under sediment or moving too slowly to leave an obvious scar at the surface. The nearest well-studied structure to Saturday's epicenter is the Raramu Fault, part of what geologists call the Ruapihu Graben, a block of crust that has literally dropped down between two fault systems, and even that structure sits roughly 30 kilometers away. Whatever broke on Saturday morning, it broke quietly, with no history, no warning signs, and no name. Now the focus shifts to the volcanoes, because if you look at a map, this earthquake happened uncomfortably close to some of the most dangerous volcanic terrain on Earth. Mount Ruapehu sits about 55 kilometers to the southeast of the epicenter. Tongariro and Ngauruhoe are not far beyond it. And the Taupo Volcanic Zone, the belt of stretched, thinned crust that runs from Ruapehu all the way north to White Island, sits directly adjacent to where this quake occurred. So the obvious question, the one that anyone living in that region immediately asks, is whether this was volcanic. Was this magma on the move? As of Saturday afternoon, GeoNet's answer was no. The volcanic alert levels were unchanged. Ruapehu remained at level 1, which indicates minor unrest, a status it had already been sitting at well before the earthquake struck. Tongariro, Ngauruhoe, and Taupo all remained at level 0. This was confirmed as a tectonic earthquake, rock breaking under stress, not magma forcing its way toward the surface. But that is not the real story. The real connection between this earthquake and the volcanoes next door is more subtle and more important than a simple yes or no. Taumarunui sits at the western edge of the Taupo Volcanic Zone. That zone exists because the crust across the central North Island is being stretched by the same deep tectonic forces that allow magma to punch through and feed the volcanoes to the east. That stretching does not stop cleanly at the edge of the volcanic zone. It keeps pulling at the crust along the margins too. And that is exactly the kind of pulling that produces normal faulting earthquakes like the one that just struck. So while Ruapehu did not cause this earthquake, the two events come from the same underlying engine, the same slow-motion stretching of the North Island's crust, driven by the Pacific Plate sinking beneath it far below. And there was one more strange effect. GeoNet noted that the seismic waves from this quake dissipated unusually quickly as they crossed the volcanic zone itself. The hot, fractured rock underneath the volcanic plateau appears to absorb seismic energy, which is why the shaking traveled much further to the north and south than it did to the east. The volcanoes did not cause the earthquake, but they shaped exactly how far it reached. One more thing you need to know, because this is where the danger becomes immediate rather than theoretical. Aftershocks. GeoNet located 78 of them within the first 6 hours alone, the largest reaching magnitude 3, 7. Other monitoring sources logged at least 11 aftershocks ranging between magnitude 2, 2 and 3. 7 in that same window, striking again and again within 10 kilometers of Taumarunui, some less than 15 minutes apart. And the seismologist tracking this sequence gave a warning that should not be brushed aside. He said this activity could continue for a week, more or less, regularly, before beginning to taper off. And then he went further. He said the region could still be feeling earthquakes connected to the same event years from now, just much, much smaller. That is not a one-night event. That is the ground settling into a new, unstable state that could keep producing tremors for a very long time. This is where it becomes dangerous on the ground, not just underground. The district had already been soaked by heavy overnight rain before the earthquake ever struck, and that combination, saturated hillsides plus violent shaking, is exactly the recipe for landslides. State Highway 43 closed completely between Wangamamona and Taumarunui. A slip shut State Highway 3 through the Awakino Gorge, cutting off the route between Mokau and Piopio. State Highway 4 stayed open, but crews were reporting multiple slips along it regardless. In Ruapehu District, local authorities confirmed several slips on Otanui South Road, with one blockage, severe enough that a resident could not get out of their own property. Geotechnical crews were dispatched at first light to assess whether these slopes were still safe. GeoNet's warning was blunt. With the ground already destabilized by rain and now fractured further by the quake, landslides may keep occurring around the epicenter, and anyone who sees fresh cracks or slumping ground was told to stay well clear and report it immediately. For farmers across the King Country and Ruapehu districts, this combination of rain-soaked ground and repeated shaking is more than an inconvenience. It is a direct threat to fencing, stock access, and paddocks built on hill country that was already fragile before the quake struck. A fresh slip does not just close a state highway, it can cut off a farm access road for days, isolate stock and paddocks that are no longer safe to reach, and force a farmer to reroute machinery around ground nobody has yet confirmed is stable. Multiply that across dozens of properties scattered through hill country that has now been shaken from underneath, and you start to understand why local authorities were asking residents on rural roads to drive with extreme care and to treat every slope as a potential hazard until crews had physically inspected it. Now picture what this actually looked like for the people living through it. In Taumarunui itself, the mayor of Ruapehu district, Weston Curtin, who lives just 3 kilometers south of the epicenter, described the earthquake in one word: traumatic. He confirmed that 1 or 2 commercial buildings in town had been affected, with broken glass and minor structural impacts. At the Taumarunui Resource Recovery Center, a worker named Emily Jasmine walked in that morning to find broken glass scattered across the floor and roughly 10 smashed vases waiting to be cleaned up. She said it looked worse than it actually was, that the ugly ornaments somehow survived, while the fragile ones did not. Small, strange details that stick in your memory after something like this happens. 40 kilometers away in Wanganui, in the suburb of Springvale, a resident named Kushela Robson described the tremor as a long, rolling, prolonged motion that felt like it would never stop. She said her first instinct was to wonder whether she should even try to get out of bed, and whether she would be able to stand if she did. That single moment, lying still in the dark, unsure whether it is safer to move or safer to stay put, is the exact experience that tens of thousands of people across the central and lower North Island went through in the same 60 seconds that morning. And here is the part that genuinely surprised even the scientists studying it: fire and emergency. New Zealand confirmed there were 0 quake-related callouts. Civil defense for the Manawatu-Wanganui region reported no immediate injuries and no building damage beyond what was already noted in Taumarunui. Power, water, and communications all stayed online across the affected area. For a magnitude 5, 9 earthquake with severe shaking at intensity 6. 5 delivered directly into a populated district from just 9 kilometers down. The fact that nobody was seriously hurt is, frankly, closer to luck than guarantee. A shallow, severe earthquake striking at 4:51 in the morning, when almost everyone is home, asleep and unprepared, is exactly the kind of scenario that seismic engineers spend their careers trying to plan for. This time, the district got away with broken glass and closed roads. The next one, on an unmapped fault nobody is watching, might not be so forgiving. But here's the problem that puts all of this in context. 9 days before this quake struck Taumarunui, another magnitude 5. 9 earthquake hit near Tianau on the South Island, roughly 1,000 kilometers away, shaking homes across Otago, Southland, and parts of Canterbury, and triggering a tsunami warning from New Zealand's National Emergency Management Agency for the west coast of the South Island, from Milford Sound to Puisaker Point. That agency told residents that even if they had not felt the shaking themselves, evacuation should still be immediate because a damaging tsunami was possible. Scientists have confirmed that the Te Anau quake and the Taumarunui quake are not connected. They come from entirely different tectonic processes on completely different parts of the plate boundary, but 2 severe magnitude 5. 9 earthquakes in 2 different regions of the same small country, 9 days apart, is not a pattern in the scientific sense. It is, however, a reminder that New Zealand sits directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, the 25,000-mile belt of fault lines and volcanoes responsible for roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes, and that reminder is landing twice in the same 10-day stretch. This is where the history matters. Newswire searched GeoNet's full earthquake catalog, going back to the year 1900, for every shallow earthquake, meaning 40 kilometers deep or less, within roughly 35 kilometers of Taumarunui. In 1957, the largest recorded event was a magnitude 4. 9. In 1995, it was a 4. 8. In 1997, a 4. 6. In 2020, the district saw a magnitude 5. 2, though that one struck 23 kilometers down, deep enough to soften its impact at the surface. Saturday's earthquake at magnitude 5. 9, and only 9 kilometers deep, is now officially the strongest shallow earthquake ever recorded in the immediate Taumarunui area, in the entire modern instrumental record stretching back more than a century. That is not hype. That is what the data shows. And there is an even more direct comparison sitting just 20 kilometers southwest of Saturday's epicenter. In October of 2018, a magnitude in 6, 2 earthquakes struck beneath the same general part of the King Country, but that one ruptured 207 kilometers underground, deep inside the slab of Pacific Plate sinking beneath the North Island. A quake that deep spreads its energy across a massive area and arrives at the surface already weakened. Saturday's quake did the opposite. 9 kilometers down, it delivered its full force straight up into the towns above, which is exactly why the shaking felt so much more violent this time. On paper, a smaller magnitude; in practice, a far more dangerous, more directly felt event. Most people are missing this next detail, and it matters more than the magnitude number itself. There is even disagreement between international and domestic monitoring agencies on how big this earthquake actually was. The United States Geological Survey lists the event at moment magnitude 5. 7. GeoNet's preferred figure, using a different calculation method, is 5. 9. Both are correct within their own systems. It is a difference of measurement technique, not a revision or a downgrade, but it illustrates something important, that even with all of today's monitoring technology, describing exactly how big an earthquake was and exactly what fault produced it, still involves real scientific uncertainty in real time. The moment tensor analysis from the USGS, an assessment of the radiation pattern the quake produced, confirmed the crust failed under extension, pulling apart roughly north to south, with a real sideways component to the movement as well. But the physics allows for 2 different possible fault orientations, one running east to west, one running northeast to southwest, and right now, the data alone cannot say for certain which one actually slipped. Early mapping of the aftershock cluster shows it spreading southwest from the epicenter, which hints at the northeast to southwest orientation, but scientists are clear that this is suggestive, not conclusive. It will take weeks of precisely located aftershock data to settle the question. And now the timeline shifts to what comes next, because this is not a closed story. GeoNet's official response carries a standing caveat that residents in the region need to sit with. There is always the possibility of another earthquake of similar size, or larger, following an event like this. Aftershock sequences on shallow unmapped faults are inherently harder to forecast than sequences on well-studied structures, because scientists do not yet have a complete picture of the fault geometry they are dealing with. The advice being given to residents is simple and urgent. If you feel a strong aftershock, drop, cover, and hold. If you see fresh cracks or slumping ground near the epicenter, stay well clear and report it rather than investigating yourself. The U.S. Embassy in New Zealand issued its own alert to American citizens in the area, warning that aftershocks capable of causing damage may continue to occur, and advising people to stay away from any structures that show signs of damage and to keep monitoring official emergency broadcasts for updates. Think about what that means for the families living across this district right now. Farmers checking fence lines and stock paddocks for fresh ground movement. Parents deciding whether it is safe to let their kids sleep in their own bedrooms tonight, or whether the whole family should stay together in one room, closer to an exit. Small business owners in Taumarunui, sweeping up glass for the 2nd or 3rd time this week, wondering if the next tremor will be the one that finally cracks a wall instead of just a window. Drivers on State Highway 3 and State Highway 43 checking road status updates before every single trip, because a route that was clear yesterday might be blocked by a fresh slip today. This is what it actually looks like to live inside an aftershock sequence on a fault that scientists still cannot fully identify. It is not one dramatic night. It is a slow, grinding uncertainty that follows you into the shower, into the car, into bed, for days and potentially weeks at a time. What happened next changed the way scientists are talking about this entire region. Because if an earthquake this size can strike on a fault with 0 prior mapping, 0 historical seismicity, and 0 warning signs, in a part of the country previously considered relatively quiet, then the honest, uncomfortable conclusion being drawn by geologists right now is that similar faults could exist anywhere else along that same margin of the Taupo Volcanic Zone, completely undetected, until the moment they too decide to break. Research led by geologists at Victoria University has already mapped a related structure known as the Taranaki-Ruapehu line, a crustal boundary crossing the island near the same latitude, though the earthquakes historically associated with that structure sit much deeper, between 25 and 35 kilometers down, than Saturday's shallow 9-kilometer rupture. Until further analysis is published by GNS Science, the honest answer to which exact fault ruptured on Saturday morning remains, in the words of the scientists studying it, simply unknown. This next part matters most of all if you live anywhere in the central North Island, from Taranaki through the King Country, across to Ruapehu, up through Waikato, and out toward the Bay of Plenty. GeoNet's landslide response team is actively asking residents in the region to report any signs of fresh ground instability, because right now, days after the main shock, the danger has not passed. It has simply changed shape. The earthquake risk has become a landslide risk, the magnitude 5. 9 risk has become 100 small magnitude 2, magnitude 3 aftershock risk, each one small enough to barely register on its own, but each one capable of loosening ground that is already saturated and already fractured. Seismologists are telling residents plainly that this sequence is not finished. that the frequency of aftershocks is expected to decrease over the coming days, but that the possibility of another significant event on a fault system nobody had ever mapped before Saturday morning cannot be ruled out. Here is why this is serious in a way that goes beyond one town. New Zealand sits on a stretch of the Pacific Ring of Fire where the region around the epicenter alone sees a magnitude 5 or higher earthquake roughly 2 to 3 times a year on average, and a magnitude 6 or higher only about once every 9 years. A shallow, severe magnitude 5.9 earthquake, delivered directly into a populated district, is not the kind of event that happens routinely, even in a country as seismically active as this one. It sits near the upper end of what residents in a quiet rural area can expect to feel in an entire decade, and it arrived without a single mapped fault line to explain it in advance. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of the technical detail. The system that is supposed to warn people ahead of time, the fault maps, the historical seismicity records, the hazard models built from more than a century of data, had nothing on file for this exact patch of ground. The earthquake did not break the rules. It simply exposed how much of the rulebook for this particular stretch of New Zealand had never been written. Consider also what this means beyond Taumarunui itself, for the wider stretch of the North Island that felt this quake roll through their homes on Saturday morning. Auckland felt it, Hamilton felt it, Rotorua and Taupo felt it, sitting right on the edge of the same volcanic zone this fault is connected to. New Plymouth, Napier, Hastings, Palmerston North, Wanganui, Wellington, all the way to the top of the South Island, felt some version of the same rolling motion that woke Taumarunui at 4:51 in the morning. An event on an unmapped fault in a quiet rural district managed to reach millions of people in a matter of seconds. That is the nature of a shallow earthquake on New Zealand's stretched, fractured crust. Distance does not guarantee safety, and a region nobody was watching closely can still send a jolt through the country's largest cities. And there is still no answer to the single biggest question hanging over this entire event: which fault actually broke? Scientists have narrowed it to 2 possible orientations. They have pointed to the Raurimu Fault and the Ruapehu Graben as the nearest known structures. They have ruled out any connection to the volcanoes despite the uncomfortably close distance to Ruapehu, and they have confirmed this is the strongest shallow earthquake ever recorded in the immediate Taumarunui area, going back more than a century. But the fault itself remains unnamed, unmapped, and only partially understood, sitting quietly beneath a district that had no idea it was there until 4:51 on Saturday morning. The next 12 hours could bring another aftershock, strong enough to bring down more slips on roads that are only just reopening. The next few weeks could bring the confirmation, or the correction, of exactly which fault plane actually ruptured beneath Taumarunui. And the coming months, according to the very scientists tracking this sequence in real time, could still bring earthquakes connected to this same event, smaller each time, but still capable of rattling homes across a district that has already had one very rude, very early wake-up call this year. This system is still evolving. The fault involved does not even have a name yet. And for a region sitting on the edge of one of the most geologically active zones on the entire planet, that is not a small detail to leave unresolved.